Well, good evening and welcome to another episode of Canada, a User's Guide and Owner's Manual. Tonight, we're going to be speaking about foreign interference. It's been hot and in the news a lot lately, but just what is foreign interference? And why is it that is when the UN and the WEF and other countries like Israel lobby and donate to our political parties and offer up trips and other inducements, why is that not called interference? But when China does it, then we get concerned. And we should be concerned, don't get me wrong, but there is a difference at play here. And we've known about this foreign interference from many places for a long time. We'll go back and do a little bit of history, show why and how our political parties are acting the way they are doing, and let you decide what is interference, or is it cooperation with our political parties? Stay tuned for a lovely evening. You'll be interested to hear and see how long this has been happening in Canada.
It's a Chinese intelligence tactic to label critics of the Chinese Communist Party as anti-Asian or racist.
The rise in anti-Asian racism.
We go in free trade negotiations with the objective of facilitating the private sector. They're going in with the objective of facilitating the Chinese state meeting its objectives.
We already know that they've sent Ebola virus to China and that they're working with the Chinese military scientists. This is known.
Welcome to Canada, a User's Guide and Owner's Manual. Welcome to this week's edition of Canada, a User's Guide and Owner's Manual. The talk of foreign interference has been significant lately.
Foreign interference in Canada?
We told him to release the names.
Foreign interference.
But is it new?
Richard Fadden is sticking by his comments. The CSIS director says he has no reason to apologize for what he said.
The National taped a speech Fadden delivered at a Toronto dinner.
There are ministers of the Crown.
It was there Fadden first said cabinet ministers in 2 provinces were under the sway of foreign governments. Fadden told MPs he forgot he was being taped.
You've created great consternation and anxiety, unwarranted suspicion, and unfounded stain on every municipal elected official in British Columbia, and indeed every provincial cabinet minister in the country. Do you acknowledge that, sir?
No, sir, I do not. If I had simply said there is foreign interference in Canada, you ladies and gentlemen would all be at your holidays right now.
During my 15 years in elected office, foreign interference was well known to many people. But first we need to ask ourselves, is it really interference? During my time in the Ontario Parliament, it was quite commonplace for foreign countries like China, Taiwan, and Israel to offer up and take elected members on all expense-paid trips, junkets, to their countries, and apparently no strings attached. But there's much more. Let's remember the 2 Chinese scientists at the Winnipeg Biosecurity Lab that sort of has gone into the memory hole.
There's no reason for Ottawa to be secretive about this. We already know that they've sent Ebola virus to China and that they're working with the Chinese military scientists. This is known. What else are they hiding?
And if you're old enough to remember, like I am, the many trade junkets that Prime Ministers Mulroney, Chrétien, and even Harper all took hundreds of prominent Canadian business people to China to explore business opportunities. And while we're talking about business, let's also take a little look into the Canada-China Business Council, made up the most powerful, most profitable Canadian businesses, and is led and has former Liberal and former Conservative ministers of the Crown running that operation. And this is not the first time CSIS has talked about foreign interference. Back in the early 1990s, the RCMP and CSIS put out a draft report on foreign involvement in our political system and our corporate businesses. It was called Project Sidewinder, but that has gone into the memory hole as well.
The tycoons of Hong Kong started to buy large portions of Vancouver real estate in the late 80s. This coincided with the arrival of triads that are very related to the tycoons and a flow in of heroin. And that the real estate and the drug money can't be separated in my analysis. My research showed once the game Baccarat and higher bet limits were introduced in 1997, that coincided very well with the arrival of the triads from Macau and Hong Kong, and the money laundering that was accepted by the local police and BC government just rose exponentially from that point.
More than $5 billion in dirty money went into the real estate market last year alone.
At a high level, China is making huge money from fentanyl. It's made in the factories. It's coming west. They could stop it if they wanted to, but they're not. So what's the problem here?
Their mindset is entirely different than ours. We go in free trade negotiations with the objective of facilitating the private sector. Right. They're going in with the objective of facilitating the Chinese state meeting its objectives.
It's a Chinese intelligence tactic to label critics of the Chinese Communist Party as anti-Asian or racist.
One of the things we've seen, unfortunately, over the past years is a rise in anti-Asian racism linked to the pandemic and concerns being risen around people's loyalties. I want to make everyone understand fully. Han Dong is an outstanding member of our team, and suggestions that he is somehow not loyal to Canada should not be entertained.
Our Prime Minister is echoing a Chinese intelligence argument, whether he knows it or not.
When we take a look at all these different subjects in this week's episode, we might want to ask ourselves, is it foreign interference, or is it indeed foreign collaboration with our political parties? Stay tuned. Well, thanks again. Before we get into tonight's show and introduce our guests, let's just take a moment. Something happened last week that we may all remember, but there was an down south of the border. And an impressive victory by Donald Trump last week. And now we know that Trump not only has won the popular vote, the Electoral College, but the Republicans have gained control of the Senate and the Congress. Pretty impressive, and really impressive when you look at the obstacles and the obstructions that he had to overcome. And I think this bodes well for Canadians. Just remember, he had the entire corporate media of the United States against him. He had the Department of Justice and many states' attorney generals against him. They even had some assassination attempts on him. But through all that, Donald Trump has regained the White House. And I think the era of globalism is going to get checked for a little bit. And it's a real great thing, in my view, as well, to see that people like RFK and Elon has joined Donald Trump. So good things are on the horizon. So with that, let me introduce Lee Stewie as a guest for this evening.
Hi, Randy. How's it going?
Good to see you, Lee.
Yeah, you
Many
too.
Many people know that she's a great freedom fighter from Southern Ontario.
Yes, I am. There's just going to be a bit of housekeeping before we get started here, just in case you've missed the first 3 or 4 episodes. Well, we're on the 4th one now, but the first 3 episodes of just how kind of this show works. The last portion of the stream is going to be Randy answering your questions that were submitted to his website at randyhillier.com/ask a question. But if you didn't get a chance to submit your question before the stream, you can send in a super chat on YouTube and on Entropy, and we will address those questions at the end of the stream. If you're watching this on the replay and you missed the live, you can donate to Randy's website, No More Lockdowns /donate, if you want to help contribute to his legal fees. And there's also a Twitter space after at 9:30. So head on over to Twitter after the stream, and you can interact with Randy there as well. I think that covers it.
Thank you very much, Lee, and that is for to help the production of this show as well. NoMoreLockdowns.ca, and the Twitter space is being hosted on the No More Lockdown Twitter account as well. So with that, we'll also introduce our second guest, the farmer from Glengarry and McCrae friend, Sean McCrae, is joining us from Glengarry County tonight as well.
Hi, Randy. Thanks for having me on.
Good to see you again. So listen, tonight we're going to get into this, and I think many people have that question. Just what is interference? What is foreign interference? And why is it that the actions of so many others that are similar to China are not seen as interference? We see the UN, the WEF, Israel, Taiwan, many corporations doing very similar activities that China is alleged to be doing and are doing, but they're not seen as
bad actors,
wrongdoing, or but I would say they're all in on the game, and what they're doing is all bad, but China gets singled out a little bit more, and maybe there's cause for it. So let's explore that a little bit tonight.
So I think my first question, I'm gonna lay it out on the table. Is foreign interference just another form of globalism?
I think in large part it is, but for whatever reason, we've accepted that supranational organizations like the UN and multinational non-governmental organizations like the WEF have a good and proper and legitimate role in altering the laws of our country, changing the policies of our country, and that they're also legitimate donators and funders of our political system. And I would say that in large part, our two main political parties, the Liberals and the Conservatives, they're the worst ones. They're not the only ones, but they have really become addicted to the money of the supranational entities. They've become addicted to the money from the corporations, and foreign and domestic, and they have abdicated their responsibility to the people of Canada in exchange for that those handsome payoffs. It's, in my view, it should all be seen more as a criminal light. I guess we can say it, and again, this is not exclusive to China, but they're one of the worst offenders of it. There is a nexus between all these organizations, the multinational corporations, the supranational entities like the WEF, the UN, along with money laundering and criminal activity. There is an intersection point, and I think all these outfits that we've just talked about, and many more, have found Canada to be a comfortable place for that nexus of organized crime, money laundering, and investments. As we saw in the clip earlier, in 1 year alone in 2018, it's suspected that over $5 billion of dirty money was laundered into Vancouver real estate. So Canada has become a safe haven for a lot of skullduggery under the guise of globalism.
So last week we talked about corporations influencing politicians. So with that being said, are corporations that have foreign subsidiaries in Canada, such as China with TikTok and Huawei, is that a form as well of interference?
Oh, absolutely. And this is one of the very purposes of it is where this nexus between all these different outfits arrive here in Canada is, as I said earlier, the political parties are addicted to this money. And they don't really care where it comes from as long as there's plenty of it. And as long as it's been cleaned before they get their hands on it. So that's where Canada becomes a very safe haven as well, cleaning and laundering that money through our casinos and other entities, and creating shell corporations and actual real companies as well, and then using the legitimacy of Canadian companies. They may be foreign owned, they may have been purchased with uh, um, ill-gotten gains, but but then they use that money through a legitimate corporation to donate to the political parties and exert significant influence over the politicians and the political parties to ensure that this steady stream of skullduggery continues, that the politicians and the political parties will not prevent their operations from going on. Like, and maybe a good example of that, Lee, is the fentanyl crisis in our country. This has been going on for years and years now. The drug problem has been going on for decades. The government seems unwilling or unable to prevent this massive influx of dangerous fentanyl coming in. But, when we think of it, during COVID, the government was exceptionally, they did an exceptional job. And still to this day, they're doing an exceptional job preventing things like ivermectin from coming into the country. It's a little white pill as well. We can stop one little white pill coming in, but if it's from China, we can't. So I think that's an important view. Why are we not able to change these policies, and why are we not able to close up our borders? Well, the people funding our political parties are making sure that these pipelines stay open.
Sorry, go ahead.
There was a comment. I feel like the kindness of Canadians has been taken advantage of, and I believe that's true. Also, innocence, or naivete in some cases, including myself. So when I was being raised on a grain and oilseeds farm here in Eastern Ontario, globalism to me meant I can produce my crops and trade with anybody in the world. And the only thing that ever mucked things up was the government getting involved. So that's the evolution of things here, is that it's clearly globalism and what we're talking about here tonight, interference and cooperation. We can cooperate as exporters of Canadian products to the rest of the world, and that's trade. But when the government gets involved, that's graft. So
I think there's a couple of important things there, Sean, that you raise up. And, one is that people's understanding of what the term globalism is very different for different people. And I think it's been changing with COVID. But, when I was younger, globalism was sold as things like free trade agreements and harmonized tariffs so that countries could export and import licensed legal products efficiently. But we've seen that has really morphed. It's no longer just about trade in legal products. It's about, there's a cultural component to globalism now. There's an important social component to globalism with things like DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. There's a very important social aspect as well, is the diminishment of national borders and the explosion of immigration. And then, of course, it's the harmonized laws for all countries that we saw during COVID, that now the WHO will be the determining factor in your nation's policies for health, and more of these treaties are being signed and undertaken. Yeah, and then the first part of your question was about the innocence and naivety, and I think that is in large part. It's again, it's much harder to take advantage of someone who is skeptical rather than somebody who is innocent and naive. And I think the Canadian electorate has been very willing to not have oversight on what's going on in the political system, and took that approach of innocence and naivety and said, well, our politicians are going to do well for us, and we don't actually have to look too closely at what they're doing. And while we were asleep on the farm or wherever else, a lot of bad things were going on. And we'll talk about this a little bit later on. This is, the first documented evidence that the government knew of organized crime and political involvement with organized crime and foreign corporations was in a report called the Sidewinder Report that was issued by CSIS and RCMP in 1997, but was so damning and showed just how much the political parties were involved in this skullduggery, that the government of the day buried the report and discredited the report. Some copies, as we're seeing, still remain online, but all governments have recognized that did happen, that there was important evidence in there, but they've been successful in creating the illusion that we've just heard about foreign interference for the first time today, but it's been around for 30 years at least.
Yeah.
So are there any examples of another country interfering with or intentionally sinking a Canadian corporation in order to gain a foreign subsidiary?
Yeah, so most of it, there's like China is a giant in the economic world now, so there's a lot of examples of their companies uprooting and displacing Canadian companies, and often in sensitive and classified areas. a good example of is what happened to the great Canadian, iconic Canadian company Nortel, which was the world's leader in telecommunications, and they were taken down. And as the suspicion is, and there's fairly good evidence of this, of Huawei, another Chinese company, and with significant state-owned interests in it, was very successful in corporate espionage and hacking and various different things to steal Nortel's intellectual property and undercut them and place, this iconic company into bankruptcy. And I think at the time when Nortel went down, there was I think they still had about 100,000 employees. Many of them located in Ottawa, but also Brampton and various facilities across the country. All their pensioners took a bath when they went down as well, and that's just that's one of the big ones. But there's been Chinese state-owned enterprises now are heavily involved and receiving taxpayer subsidies as well in the continuing in telecommunications field, and also the entertainment industries, the publishing. One of the largest Chinese daily newspapers outside of China is here in Canada, and it was was partially owned by the Toronto Star. So they're getting subsidies as well. All the media giants are, and of course, another big place where China is involved is in our oil and gas leases and natural resource, pulp and paper, coal, etc., and are all get heavily subsidized in different ways, or are able to be subsidized. There's what makes China their companies doing this somewhat different is because so many of them are heavily or partially owned by the Chinese state or fully owned. So to give a bit of a comparison, it would be like CBC setting up shop in Shanghai or Beijing and saying we want to compete in Shanghai or Beijing. Now, you and I and most of us would say that the reason why we have a publicly owned broadcaster here is to serve the Canadian people, not to serve the Chinese people in China. But that there are other that's really the significant difference with China as compared to the other countries.
There was an interesting paragraph in that Sidewinder document describing how, and this is obviously it was written in 1997, so this is an old story, but it's on point. The one of the first types of companies that were targeted were Canadian companies, that is, produced video and audio equipment, and the authors posed the question, how many how much of the infrastructure, video and audio infrastructure, has been installed across the country in government buildings. So that's old-fashioned espionage right from the Cold War.
Including military installations. And just to give some credibility to that, the U.S. government has prevented Huawei from they have prevented Huawei from providing any of the infrastructure in the telecommunications in the United States for that specific reason that they believe that the information traveling over their communication systems would be diverted, hacked, and whatever. Canada has not implemented any of those same safeguards or restrictions that the Americans are so concerned about. So again, beggars the question: why is Huawei being treated so with kids' gloves here, but not in the United States? And again, you can trace that back to the level of corporate money coming from China or coming from their organized crime and being laundered here to make sure that Canadian politicians don't restrict or limit their business opportunities here. Listen, we saw that in spades just a couple years ago when I think it was the president or the chief financial officer of Huawei was in Canada and the United States, charged her with criminal offenses, and she was held in Canada. Canada refused to deport her for, I think it was close to 2 years, and she was kept under house arrest in a palatial mansion in BC during this time. And then Canada orchestrated a deal where we got the two Michaels back that were being held in China in exchange for sending Meng Wanzhou back to China and not allowing her to be
extradited.
To the United States. So that's people might want to scratch their head at that. Just to give an example, is in another very similar case to Meng Wanzhou was the two Chinese scientists at the Winnipeg Biosecurity Lab that just before COVID were charged criminally with exporting dangerous pathogens and viruses without authorization to the Wuhan lab in China. They were fired. They were charged, but they weren't detained, and they, some might say they were allowed to escape Canada. Typically, when people are engaged in espionage and things of that nature, dealing with very highly contagious pathogens, maybe most countries would be a little bit more diligent about prosecuting them. But Canada was I think Canada was happy to see them get out of Dodge before what evidence would become revealed in the Canadian courts with those two scientists.
Wow.
So I've seen this article that says the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs has taken nearly 25% of Canadian MPs on free trips to Israel, and I also remember the Aga Khan scandal with Justin Trudeau. So what is exactly going on here?
Well, it's the same thing, or similar. The parallels are very similar. When I was in elected office, uh, every the three big ones were Israel, China, and Taiwan. Um, Taiwan has dropped off the agenda, and the two big ones that remain is Israel and China, um, providing a significant number of inducements and benefits to elected people at the provincial level as well as the federal level. They take them to on all expense paid trips to their countries. They wine and dine these individuals. They put them up in 5-star hotels, take them on exotic and luxurious trips, and also make sure that they are introduced and wined and dined at with significant players in their country at the consulates and whatnot, um, and of course, in the States, it's been fairly well known for some time, and getting a lot of information is APAC in the States. But there's a host of here we have the CIJA, but there's also the Canadian Jewish Political Action Committee. There's a number of different Israeli-backed organizations here that are involved with funneling lots of cash to the political parties. And as that note, 25% of our MPs have had a free trip to Israel. Well, why? And why is it Israel and China are the two most prolific players in this? Like I said, there are a couple of others, but and of course, at the end of the day, it's with Israel, we say it's influence. With China, we say it's interference. I don't know how you thread that needle accurately. Both are wrong. Those actions, in my view, are wrong. They should both be seen, um, if not as a criminal action, at least a procedural and administrative wrongdoing. But I think it borders close to criminal, because what they are doing is they're convincing Canadian politicians and political parties to take the interests of Israel ahead of the interests of Canada. They're taking and convincing Canadian politicians that the interests of China are more important than the interests of Canadians. I guess we can say, uh, uh, it's called influence by Israel because we're friendly with them. It's called interference from China because we're not as friendly with them, not these days anyway. Um, so we're still pretty friendly with them, as we can see from the evidence. But it's
Well,
criminal.
there's a bit of a distinction too in how this has evolved, where Brian Mulroney took an envelope full of cash, and that was a very straightforward, old-fashioned deal. Whereas, as you're describing the junkets, it's also about stroking egos and a little bit of mind control and maybe a little bit of getting some dirt on somebody so that they can be more easily controlled.
Yeah, I don't think it's so much dirt. It's a big part of the con that goes on um, nowadays is like these people will come to your office and they'll say, Randy, you're such a nice guy. Your constituents love you. You do such a marvelous job representing them. Uh, we want you to come and we want to show our appreciation for just how good you are. And we want you to show our people what it takes to be a great representative. And the flattery and the skill of the con is pretty good. And you know uh, as the old saying, flattery will get you everywhere. When you're dealing with politicians, like uh, a little bit of flattery goes a long way with ego in politics. So I don't think now they may get dirt because not that I've never taken anybody up on a free trip to Israel, and I know if China had ever invited me to go to China, they probably would. I'd be in with the Uyghurs, or I'd be in the organ harvesting detention camp. I've always been a very outspoken against communist China, so they never invited me, and I certainly would never have gone. So, but no, I've not taken any of these trips anywhere. It's I think it's just a dangerous step for politicians to take.
It reminds me of the Pinocchio story when he was invited to Candy Island or whatever it was called.
Yes, yes.
Haven't seen that in a long, long time, but there was some flattery involved there, and all the sweet treats that were going to be there, and it was a hard lesson to learn.
Yeah, for Pinocchio,
Not a new story.
Obviously, Pinocchio has learned that lessons a lot better than our politicians have.
Yeah.
So you brought up Project Sidewinder, and I think we should kind of go into that a little bit, because I had never heard of this until you brought it up in your video. To a lot of people, hearing about foreign interference lately is a huge scandal, but according to Project Sidewinder, this has been going on since the early 1990s. And so what the problems that were mentioned in the report developed throughout the last few decades up until now. So what exactly is, in just kind of like the cliff notes of what is exactly Project Sidewinder?
So this all started in the 80s, and one of the guys that was really involved and instrumental in it was a RCMP. There was an RCMP officer assigned to the Hong Kong consulate in the 80s. His name was Brian McAdam, and I spoke to him a number of years back. But he blew the whistle about how that the people employed by the Canadian consulate in Hong Kong at the time were actually they were criminals. They were working for the triads, and they were selling visas and passports, and facilitating. This was in the 80s, and a lot of the criminal guys were trying to get their dough out of Hong Kong before China took over, and so I think it was McAdam was the first one to release this story. But anyway, he was certainly involved in it, and that's where it sort of came out that the Communist Chinese Party and the triads made a deal along with the Hong Kong, the wealthy Hong Kong corporations and their owners to have a mutually agreeable plan of operation when Hong Kong became part of China. So that's what Project Sidewinder, although it was written in 1996 and publicized in 1997, it talks about this stuff going back to the 80s. And it also clearly points out the ties between the political parties and this known collusion between crime corporations in the Communist Chinese Party with Canadian politicians and Canadian companies. When that came out, when the draft report came out, CSIS was instructed to never let it see the light of day. But one of the authors of that report, Michelle Juno Katsua, has been at the parliamentary hearings on foreign interference. He's a private consultant now, but he was the director, the CSIS director for the Asia desk back then, and he's still going on about foreign interference. He hasn't. I don't know why he hasn't come out and said it's obviously cooperation when for 30 years we've known about this, and everybody pretends that it's just happened for the first time. And we saw in the clips earlier in the trailer was Richard Fadden, who was then the current director of CSIS, speaking at parliamentary committees, explaining that there was cabinet ministers and politicians who we knew had evidence that they were acting specifically for China's interests. When I was in the legislature, it was the Liberal minister at the time was Michael Chan, that it was floated out that he was involved in that. And then also Han Dong, who was a member of the Ontario legislature and then went on to become a member federally. But there's been other names as well that have been bandied about, Vincent Key and now a number of senators as well. But I think, that misses the point when we're naming individuals, because it is the political parties know full well. I'll share one little story. It's a minor story, but I think it's interesting. Back in 2009, it was the 60th anniversary of the Communist Chinese takeover of China, and they wanted to raise the flag, the Communist Chinese flag, at the legislature, and we had a caucus discussion about this, about who was going to go and attend, and I was outraged. Outraged first that the Communist Chinese were going to be raising their flag at the Ontario Parliament, and that we were all supposed to go out and celebrate and applaud this. And I said, hold on here. I think we're supposed to be conservatives, and we're supposed to be free market capitalists, and we should not be applauding and commemorating the 60th anniversary of one of the most brutal, murderous regimes that human history has known. Did I get a spanking in caucus that day? I was. They knew after the flag raising event, the entire Chinese consulate, as well as a significant number of their corporate Chinese corporate interests, etc., were meeting with all the political parties at Queen's Park afterwards. The political parties saw this as a great opportunity to further build their relationships, further establish financial interactions with these people. I was told that regardless of my protestations, the communist flag was going to be risen at the Queen's Park that day, and I wasn't welcome to be there.
But how does all this sit with say the Five Eyes and the allies that we have had for generations, and working together in terms of intelligence communities and policing?
Well, I think Australia is in a very similar position as Canada with China. In many aspects, they are a destination point. They're not as lucrative for the Chinese to do as much there commercially, because the Chinese state-owned enterprises purchasing Canadian companies give them a ready access and a competitive advantage for access into the American markets, as well as the flow of drugs like fentanyl and whatnot. It's just a much bigger market. Going back to the Five Eyes, like that's a I don't like that organization. And for people who aren't aware, that's the UK intelligence agencies, the GCHQ, the MI5, MI6. It is the Canadian CSIS and the Communication Security Establishment, along with the parallels in Australia, New Zealand, and the U.S. Homeland Security, National, and that whole apparatus. So this is an interesting part of that. All of these countries, we all have the similar laws that we are not allowed to spy and eavesdrop on our own citizens. We can do it elsewhere. Like our CSIS and our CSE can listen in to conversations around the world, but we're not allowed to listen in on to Canadians, apparently, unless there's a warrant. So each of the countries have that similar law, but there's no law that prevents CSIS from sharing their eavesdropping in the United States with the Americans, or the Americans listening in on Canadians and then sharing it with CSIS. So that's one really apparent loophole here. So everybody's listening in on everybody, and they're all breaking the law, but it's all legal type of thing. I think the Americans have some level of caution about how high up the intelligence chain Canadians are provided with. I think there is some caution about how tight our ship is.
Yes, I agree.
And so I don't think I don't think they have that same concern with Mossad in Israel or some of the other intelligence agencies. But I don't think Justin Trudeau or our intelligence services are their premier ally in many aspects. They want to be very cautious about how much information they provide. because I think we have a leaky ship here.
Yeah.
For sure. So we're reaching the last portion of the stream here. So if you want to send in a super chat to ask a question, I suggest now would be a good time, just so we can get things closed up for
Let me throw one more thing out, though, Lee. There's a little story that people may have forgotten. It was just a few years ago, when just after Justin Trudeau got elected as prime minister, there was a big brouhaha and cash for access scandal where a couple of Chinese billionaires got together with their friends and Justin in some Toronto mansions, and then this billionaire gave $200,000 to the Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation. I don't know if you remember that story.
I do.
But then they also gave another $50,000 to build a monument to Pierre Elliott Trudeau in Montreal. All legal. There was nothing illegal about this stuff. But you can see, why would some Chinese billionaire think that the Trudeau Foundation was worthy of $200,000, and why would they think that a monument or a statue to Trudeau would be a good thing for Montreal to have and for them to pay? But it's the whole gamut. Most of these guys are also very heavily involved in our banks. They're heavily involved in our real estate. So having friends and allies who are making the laws is very profitable. And it's profitable each way, as we can see from, and those are just the ones that make it into the news, but there's lots of other stories that don't make it into the news.
Well, the Han Dong situation, they covered that one up really quickly by telling people that if they were to speak about him, you are racist. So people, didn't want to talk about that anymore. That was a good way of shutting it down. And I think a great way to solve these problems is to would be not allowing MPs to have dual citizenship. But with that being said, what are some rules of engagement for Canadian politicians and businessmen when dealing with foreign countries to make sure we're putting Canada first?
Well, I'm going to say, both are, as that screenshot showed, conservative or liberal, both major political parties are addicted to this pipeline of foreign money, whether it's whatever country it comes from. And they're not going to give up those pipelines. So I think as long as we have the two major parties involved, Canadians will always be at putting a compromising and risky position with our politicians. But I think there's a couple other things. We need, one of the things that allows corruption to expand is the size of government. The more jurisdiction, the more authority, the more responsibilities government have, that opens up far more avenues and opportunities for corruption. So I think that's another really important element that people need to understand. If we want to keep growing our government, we are going to keep growing the interference, the cooperation, the influence of foreign money and foreign players. So But I think, we also need to um, look at the penalties um, that politicians are getting from our integrity commissioner. I think, what did Trudeau's penalty for accepting a $25,000 gift that he wasn't allowed to accept by going to the Aga Khan's um, island and spending Christmas there? I think it was a $200 penalty. And until there's actually some substantive penalties, the general public views a $200 penalty as something not much different than a a parking violation or a speeding ticket. So they're not going to place um, much interest in it. But it's also how I know, for example, in Ontario, members of the public can't lodge a complaint against an MPP's actions under the Integrity Act, and that's similar in many places. And I think we need to broaden those acts out so that people can actually successfully lodge a complaint if there's wrongdoing. And then we also need to broaden out that legislation so that the people who do blow the whistle on politicians who are involved in this sort of behavior are offered some sort of substantive protection. Right now, we can see if anybody was to blow the whistle on these people, our courts would take a heavy hand against the whistleblower, not the villain. So, here's a good example. There's just recently there was a RCMP director who was alleged to be engaged in espionage for foreign, and they say China, and he was sent away for I believe 15 years. It was his sentence. There was much discussion and much talk that he was actually going to be blowing the whistle on the foreign interference in our political structure. His name was Ortiz, and it was just earlier this year that he was convicted. But that's another interesting story. It looks like he was actually blowing the whistle, and the government has put him away. So all these guys, as we can see from Project Sidewinder, the Cash for Access scandals, the political parties are doing everything possible to disguise their cooperation and call it interference. But then at the same time, not a single one of the 338 members of the House of Commons have demanded or spoken out in the House saying, I want to know the names. And why is it that not a single one of the 338 have asked for the names to be revealed?
Wow. Okay. Yeah, that's that kind of goes into this question here that I see in the chat, and it says, who bought the CPC memberships to oust Brown in 2022 leadership that Pierre Poilievre won? There are grumblings that they were India operatives. No security clearance for Pierre Poilievre makes sense now.
In 2020, I know, I remember there, we talked about this last week with these bulk membership sales. And
A lot of
it-
people are bringing up India as well as China in the
Oh
chat here.
yes, yeah. No. There's other. Um, so, yeah. In last week's episode, we talked about these bulk membership sales and how the 407 um, um, database was hacked, and 60,000 names, addresses, phone numbers, etc., were hacked during the 2018 Ontario Conservative leadership. And it was very much suspected, and there were accusations and allegations, never proven, that one of the leadership contenders had that database hacked, and then used the Indian community to purchase up many tens of thousands, or maybe more than that, 100,000 memberships, all with phony baloney memberships, but did it anyway. So yeah, that leadership skullduggery and the corruption is not unknown to other, I would say the South Asian countries, India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, all those communities. We see some hanky-panky there as well.
All right. So we also have a question from your website. Like I said at the beginning of the stream, if you want to ask a question, you can submit them to Randy's website at randyhillier.com/ask-a-question. But yeah, there's one question here, and it doesn't really pertain to the topic tonight, but I think a previous stream. And they're asking, what is the real intended purpose of question period in the House other than theater, when neither party is beholden to even answer questions, nor can hold the leading party to account in an effective way?
Well, he answered his own question. You're looking for some other deeper purpose to question period, but it is theater. It is to give the illusion to the Canadian public that the government and the opposition are engaged in their interests in debating or discussing and trying to hold one another account. And it's just not true. Anybody who watches question period will understand that very quickly, that there is no sincerity in it. There's no honesty in it. There is great fanfare and there's great applause, and but it's just theater, and it gives our media something to write about and to talk about, and it gives the prime minister and the opposition leader a chance to perform on stage to the Canadian public. But none of them are being sincere or honest about it.
Yeah, I compared it, I think, on Twitter last week, that question period is just to get in front of a camera so that they can use clips of their speeches to put on social media to convince their constituents that they're actually doing something. That's,
Yeah.
I think, how I summarized it.
Well, I guess the alternative would be to say, how would these people be able to convince the Canadian public for so many years that it's worthwhile to vote for them if there wasn't an opportunity to be on display? And maybe that's the better question is, yeah, could they be doing anything of value to the Canadian population that would be noteworthy? And I think the answer would be probably not. So let's put on a show for them once a day, entertain the, give the scribes and the pundits something to talk about, and get a bunch of 2-minute clips that we can put on Twitter or social media, and get all the army of tribalists on each team barking at each other about the 2-minute Twitter video.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. I think so. We've reached the end of the stream here. Any last thoughts? I also wanted to bring up Sean has the name McRae there, and it being Remembrance Day. Is there any relation to the great poet?
Oh, good question. Not that I'm aware of. I've been to his house in Guelph, which is now a museum, and I've seen his name spelled 3 different ways, but I don't think we're well. You could call us Klansmen, maybe.
Right. Yeah.
But not
yeah.
direct relatives.
That's good enough, though.
Yeah.
Well, yeah,
and
Randy, any last thought?
Well, listen, we should also, it is Remembrance Day, and it is interesting that we have Sean McRae on here, and of course, that name is synonymous with Remembrance Day, but I think we spelled it M-A-C or
yeah, I think so.
Yeah,
I've seen MC, small c, big C, R-A-E. Yeah, I'm not. I think I had it figured out once upon a time, but then I got confused again.
The Scots were never good on those Mac words there. They came up with all kinds of different ways with them.
Changing their last names too, like on a whim, they'll just become a whole different person.
Well, listen,
they must have left it to the representative of the king at the immigration office when they got off the boat and walked into the bush.
Well, listen, thank you, everyone. I've had a lovely evening. I hope we got some good information out there for people to consider about globalism and foreign interference and or influence or cooperation, however you want to call it. Next week, we've got another guest coming on with us. We're going to be speaking about the Constitution, and we have a professor of law from Queen's University. Bruce Pardy will be joining us. Many people will know of Bruce Pardy. He was one of the few and one of the most vocal critics during COVID in the legal profession. He was in Ottawa, and he was honking his horn with many others for freedom in Ottawa and many other places. So it's going to be, I think it'll be an interesting show. We're going to talk about, the Constitution, the difference between common and statute law, maybe the amending formula, and of course, whichever other questions people have. So tune in for next Monday, and we'll talk about why some countries have a constitution and others don't, and do we have a good one or do we not? And whatever other questions that you may have for next week. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Randy.
Thanks, Randy. Thanks, chat. We'll see you next week.
Good seeing you. We'll see you again next week. Bye-bye.